the bear who became a real soldier. You think you know everything about World War II, but I bet you've never heard about the 440-pound Syrian brown bear who carried ammunition to the front lines, drank beer with his fellow soldiers, and became one of the most decorated members of the Polish army. This isn't some made-up story. This actually happened. His name was Wojtek, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why grown men cried when this bear died. Let me take you back to 1942. The world is burning. Hitler's got most of Europe under his boot. The Soviet Union and Germany are tearing each other apart on the Eastern Front. And in the middle of all this chaos, there's a group of Polish soldiers who have been through absolute hell. These men had been prisoners. They'd watched their country get split in half by the Nazis and Soviets. They'd been thrown into Soviet labor camps in Siberia where thousands of their brothers died from cold, starvation, and disease. But then something changed. Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and suddenly Stalin needed all the help he could get. So they made a deal. These Polish prisoners could form an army. They could fight. But they'd have to do it under Soviet command, and they'd have to leave from Soviet territory. The soldiers agreed. They had no choice. They just wanted to fight back against the Germans who destroyed their homeland. This newly formed army started making its way south toward Persia, modern-day Iran. The journey was brutal. They were walking through mountains, through deserts with barely any supplies. Men were still dying. But they kept moving because staying still meant death. In April 1942, this ragged group of Polish soldiers arrived at a refugee camp near Hamadan in the mountains of Persia. They were exhausted, half-starved and broken, but they were alive. That's when they met him. A young Iranian boy approached their camp. He was thin, dirty, probably hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks, but he was carrying something. Wrapped in a torn blanket was a tiny bear cub. The cub's eyes were barely open. It was shaking. The boy explained that hunters had killed the cub's mother. He'd found the baby alone in the mountains. He couldn't take care of it. He wanted to sell it. Now, these soldiers had nothing. They were living on rations that barely kept them alive. They had no money. They were preparing to march into one of the bloodiest wars in human history. Taking care of a baby bear was probably the last thing they needed. But one of the soldiers, a lieutenant named Anatol Tarnowicki, looked at that tiny, helpless cub and saw something else. Maybe he saw innocence in a world gone mad. Maybe he just felt sorry for the little thing. Whatever it was, he made a decision. They traded the cub for a few cans of food, some chocolate, and a Swiss Army knife. That's all they had. And just like that, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company of the Polish II Corps had a new member. They named him Wojtek. It's a Polish name that means he who enjoys war or smiling warrior. At the time, it was probably just a joke, a cute name for a cute bear. They had no idea how fitting it would become. At first, Wojtek was just a baby. He needed constant care. The soldiers fed him condensed milk from an old vodka bottle. They made him a little bed from a blanket. At night, when the temperature dropped in those Persian mountains, the men would take turns keeping him warm. This bear became their mascot, their pet, their little piece of home. As the weeks went by, Wojtek started growing, and I mean really growing. Bear cubs don't stay small for long. Within a few months, he was already too big to carry around easily, but the soldiers didn't care. They loved him. In a world of death and destruction, Wojtek represented life. He represented something worth protecting. The army kept moving. They marched from Persia to Palestine, thousands of miles on foot, and Wojtek went with them every step of the way. He rode in trucks with the soldiers. He slept in their tents. He ate their food. Well, he ate everyone's food if you weren't careful. And here's where things get interesting. Wojtek started copying what the soldiers did. Bears are incredibly smart animals. They learn by watching, and Wojtek was watching everything. The soldiers would wake up early for morning exercises. So Wojtek started doing exercises too. He'd stand up on his hind legs and stretch his arms out. The men thought it was hilarious at first, but then they realized he was actually trying to mimic their movements. When the soldiers marched in formation, Wojtek would walk alongside them, trying to match their pace. When they saluted their officers, Wojtek learned to raise his paw. It sounds impossible, but dozens of photographs prove it happened. But Wojtek's favorite thing, the thing he loved more than anything else, was wrestling. These soldiers were tough men. They'd survived prison camps, forced marches, starvation. They were hardened fighters, and they would spend their free time wrestling with a bear. At first, when Wojtek was small, the men could pin him down easily. They'd play fight with him like you'd roughhouse with a dog. But as he grew, things changed. By the time he was full grown, Wojtek weighed over 400 pounds and stood 6 feet tall. He could have killed any of them with one swipe of his paw. But he never did, not once. He understood it was play. He was gentle. He'd wrestle with the soldiers, pinning them down, but he never used his full strength. It was like he knew they were fragile compared to him. The men trusted him completely. They'd share their cigarettes with him. Yeah, you heard that right. Wojtek learned to smoke, or at least he learned to hold cigarettes in his mouth and puff on them. He didn't inhale properly, but he loved the ritual of it. A soldier would light a cigarette, take a drag, and pass it to Wojtek. The bear would hold it in his mouth, looking ridiculously human-like. He also developed a taste for beer. The soldiers would give him bottles of beer, and Wojtek would drink them down. His favorite was apparently beer mixed with condensed milk. He'd get a little tipsy, stumble around, and the men would laugh. It sounds crazy by today's standards, but back then, in the middle of a war, these small moments of joy were everything. But the war didn't stop. The Polish army kept training, kept preparing. By 1943, they were getting ready to join the Allied forces in combat. The British were planning an invasion of Italy. The goal was to push north, break through German defenses, and eventually liberate Rome. The Polish II Corps was chosen to be part of this campaign. They'd be fighting alongside British, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces. This was their chance to strike back at the Nazis, their chance to show the world that Poland was still fighting. There was just one problem: Wojtek. When the orders came to ship out to Italy, the British authorities said no animals were allowed on the transport ships, only official military personnel. This was non-negotiable. The ships were already overcrowded with soldiers and equipment. There was no room for pets, mascots, or bears. The Polish soldiers were devastated. They'd been with Wojtek for over a year now. He wasn't just a mascot anymore. He was their friend, their brother. The idea of leaving him behind was unbearable. So they came up with a plan. If Wojtek couldn't come as a mascot, he'd come as a soldier. They officially enlisted him into the Polish army. They gave him a serial number, a rank, and a paybook. Private Wojtek was now a legitimate member of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. On paper, he was just another soldier being deployed to Italy. The British authorities probably thought the Poles had lost their minds, but the paperwork was all in order. What could they do? So in 1943, Private Wojtek boarded a transport ship with the rest of his unit and sailed to Italy. The conditions on that ship were awful. Soldiers were crammed into every available space. It was hot, it smelled terrible, and everyone was seasick. But Wojtek handled it better than most of the men. He'd found a spot near the artillery equipment and made himself comfortable. The soldiers made sure he had food and water. They took care of their bear. When they finally arrived in Italy, the real war began. The Italian campaign was brutal. The Germans had dug into defensive positions in the mountains. Every inch of ground had to be fought for. Artillery was constantly firing. Bombs were dropping. Men were dying every single day. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company had a crucial job. They had to keep the artillery units supplied with ammunition. These big guns were firing constantly, and they went through shells at an incredible rate. Someone had to transport those heavy artillery shells from the supply trucks to the gun positions. It was dangerous, exhausting work. And this is where Wojtek proved he was more than just a mascot. The soldiers were carrying these artillery shells, and each one weighed about 25 pounds. They're awkward heavy, and you can't carry many at once. The work was slow, and in combat, slow means people die. Wojtek watched the men struggling. He saw them carrying these shells back and forth, sweating, exhausted. And then he did something nobody expected. He started helping. He walked up to a pile of shells, grabbed one in his arms and carried it to where the soldiers were stacking them. Then he went back for another, and another. At first the men thought it was a fluke, but Wojtek kept doing it. He understood what needed to be done, and he was doing it. A 440-pound bear was working alongside them, carrying ammunition like he'd been trained for it his whole life. And here's the thing that really got everyone. Wojtek never dropped a single shell, not one. These things are explosive. If you drop one wrong, people die. But Wojtek carried them carefully, almost delicately, like he understood how dangerous they were. The men were stunned. Their bear wasn't just keeping morale up anymore. He was actively contributing to the war effort. He was working harder than some of the soldiers. Word spread through the Polish forces. Other units heard about the bear who carries ammunition. At first, nobody believed it. A bear, carrying artillery shells, that's impossible. But then they'd visit the 22nd Company and see it with their own eyes. This massive bear, standing upright, cradling a 25-pound shell in his arms, walking it over to the gun position like it was the most natural thing in the world. The story that really cemented Wojtek's legend happened at Monte Cassino. If you know anything about World War II, you know that name. The Battle of Monte Cassino was one of the bloodiest, most brutal battles of the entire Italian campaign. The Germans had turned an ancient monastery on top of a mountain into a fortress. It was basically impregnable. The Allies had tried to take it multiple times and failed. Thousands of men had died trying to capture that hill. In May 1944, the Polish II Corps was given the job. They had to take Monte Cassino. It was a suicide mission and everyone knew it, but the Poles were determined. This was their moment to prove themselves, to show the world that Poland was still in the fight. The battle was hell. The Germans had machine gun nests, artillery positions, and minefields covering every approach. The Polish soldiers were climbing up steep slopes under constant fire. Men were being cut down left and right. The artillery units were firing non-stop, providing cover for the infantry trying to advance. And in the middle of all this chaos, there was Wojtek. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company was working around the clock to keep the guns supplied. Shells were being fired as fast as they could load them, and Wojtek was right there, carrying ammunition. For hours, while bombs exploded around them and bullets zipped past, Wojtek carried shell after shell. He didn't panic. He didn't run away. He stayed with his unit and did his job. The soldiers later said that seeing Wojtek working so calmly actually helped them stay calm. If the bear could keep his cool in the middle of this nightmare, so could they. After 4 days of non-stop fighting, the Poles finally captured Monte Cassino. The cost was enormous. Thousands of Polish soldiers died or were wounded, but they did it. They broke through when everyone else had failed. And Wojtek had been there for all of it. He'd become a symbol of the Polish fighting spirit. This bear, who'd started as an orphaned cub in the mountains of Persia, had fought in one of the most important battles of World War II. After Monte Cassino, Wojtek became famous. Journalists wanted to write stories about him. Photographers took his picture. The Polish II Corps officially adopted his image as their emblem. To this day, the badge of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company shows a bear carrying an artillery shell. That's Wojtek. But the war kept going. The Polish forces continued fighting their way up through Italy, and Wojtek kept serving. He'd been promoted, by the way. He wasn't a private anymore. By the end of the war, he was a corporal. Corporal Wojtek, the only bear in military history to achieve that rank. Life in the army became routine for him. He had his own tent. He slept in a wooden crate that the soldiers had modified into a bed for him. He still wrestled with the men during downtime. He still drank beer and smoked cigarettes. He'd learned to salute when officers walked by. Soldiers from other units would visit just to meet the famous bear. There's a story about Wojtek catching a spy. One night, an Arab intruder somehow got into the ammunition compound. Nobody knows if he was actually a spy or just a thief, but he was somewhere he shouldn't be. Wojtek found him. The bear roared and grabbed the guy. The man started screaming, which woke up the guards. They arrested the intruder, and Wojtek was credited with catching an enemy agent. Whether that's completely accurate or slightly exaggerated, it's a great story. Eventually, in 1945, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered. After 6 years of fighting, it was finally over. The soldiers celebrated. They'd survived. They'd won. But for the Polish soldiers, victory was bittersweet. They'd fought for the Allies. They'd bled and died alongside British and American forces. They'd liberated Italy. And yet, their homeland wasn't free. Poland had been liberated by the Soviet Union, which really meant it had been occupied by the Soviets. The government in exile that these soldiers represented wasn't allowed to return. Poland was under communist control now. These men were soldiers without a country. They couldn't go home. Many of them had families they hadn't seen in years, and they had no idea if those families were even still alive. It was devastating. The British government offered them a choice. They could stay in Britain and start new lives there, or they could return to Soviet-occupied Poland, knowing they might be arrested or killed for fighting with the Western Allies. Most chose to stay in Britain. And that meant Wojtek had to leave Italy too. In 1946, he was transported to Scotland along with many of the Polish soldiers. They were sent to a resettlement camp in the Scottish countryside, a place where they could figure out what to do with their lives now that the war was over. Wojtek lived with the soldiers in Scotland for a while, but life was different now. This wasn't a military camp. There was no mission, no purpose. The men were slowly being demobilized, leaving the army to find civilian jobs and build new lives. And as more soldiers left, Wojtek had fewer friends around. The Polish soldiers who were still with him knew they couldn't keep him forever. He was a massive bear. He needed proper care. He needed space. Keeping him in what was essentially a refugee camp wasn't fair to him. So they made a heartbreaking decision. In 1947, Wojtek was transferred to the Edinburgh Zoo. It was the right thing to do. The zoo could give him the care he needed. He'd have regular meals, veterinary care, and a safe place to live out his days. But the soldiers were devastated. They'd been with Wojtek for 5 years, through Persia, Palestine, Egypt, Italy, and now Scotland. He'd been through everything with them, and now they had to say goodbye. The day they took Wojtek to the zoo, grown men cried. These were hardened soldiers who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. They'd survived battles that had killed thousands, but saying goodbye to their bear broke them. Wojtek lived at the Edinburgh Zoo for the next 16 years. He had a good enclosure. He was well fed. Visitors loved him. He was one of the most popular animals at the zoo, but something was different. The keepers noticed that Wojtek would get excited when he heard Polish being spoken. If a group of Polish visitors came to the zoo, Wojtek would perk up. He'd move to the front of his enclosure and pay attention in a way he didn't with other visitors. And when his old soldiers came to visit, which they did as often as they could, Wojtek would go crazy. He'd recognize them. He'd stand up on his hind legs. He'd reach toward them through the bars. The soldiers would talk to him in Polish, and Wojtek would respond, making the grunting and huffing sounds bears make when they're happy. One visiting soldier even climbed into the enclosure to wrestle with Wojtek, just like the old days. The zoo staff freaked out, obviously, but Wojtek was gentle. He remembered. He'd never hurt his friends. These visits became regular events. Former members of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company would make pilgrimages to Edinburgh to see their bear. They'd bring him cigarettes, though the zoo didn't approve. They'd bring him treats. They'd spend hours just sitting near his enclosure, talking to him, remembering the war, remembering when they were all together. As the years passed, the visits became less frequent. The soldiers were getting older. Some died. Some moved away. Some were too sick to travel, but those who could still make it would come to see Wojtek. By the 1960s, Wojtek was getting old too. Bears typically live about 25 years in captivity, and he was approaching that age. He'd slowed down. He wasn't as playful as he used to be, but he still remembered. He still recognized Polish when he heard it. On December 2, 1963, Wojtek died. He was 21 years old. The zoo announced his death in the newspaper, and former Polish soldiers from all over Britain came to Edinburgh to pay their respects. There was no military funeral, no formal ceremony, but those men stood outside the zoo and mourned their friend. Some of them hadn't seen each other in years, but Wojtek's death brought them back together one last time. The story could end there. A bear who fought in a war, lived in a zoo, and died of old age. But Wojtek's legacy didn't end with his death. In Poland, which was still under communist control at the time, Wojtek became a symbol. The communists didn't want people talking about the Polish soldiers who'd fought for the Western Allies. That didn't fit their narrative. But people told stories about Wojtek anyway. Stories about the Polish bear who'd fought the Nazis, about Polish courage and resilience. After the fall of communism in 1989, Wojtek's story exploded. He became a national hero in Poland. Books were written about him. Documentaries were made. Monuments were erected. There's a statue of Wojtek in Edinburgh now, not far from where the zoo used to be. It shows him standing upright, carrying an artillery shell, just like he did at Monte Cassino. Polish and Scottish people worked together to create it because Wojtek's story belongs to both nations. There's another statue in Krakow, Poland, and one in London, and one in Italy near Monte Cassino itself. Each one shows a bear carrying a shell. Each one honors the memory of an animal who became a soldier. But more than that, Wojtek represents something important. He represents the absurdity and the humanity that can exist even in the middle of war. Here's this group of men who'd been through absolute hell. They'd lost their country. They'd watched friends die. They'd suffered in ways most of us can't imagine. And yet when they saw a helpless bear cub, they chose kindness. They chose to take care of something that needed them. And that bear gave them something back. He gave them joy. He gave them purpose. He gave them a reason to smile when everything else was darkness. Think about what that means. In the middle of World War II, one of the darkest periods in human history, there was a bear drinking beer and smoking cigarettes with Polish soldiers. There was a bear doing exercises in the morning and wrestling with his friends in the evening. There was a bear carrying ammunition through one of the bloodiest battles of the war. It's ridiculous, it's impossible, it's beautiful. The soldiers who knew Wojtek always said the same thing. He was one of them, not just a mascot, not just a pet. He was a brother in arms. He'd been through everything they'd been through. He'd suffered when they suffered. He'd worked when they worked. He'd earned his place among them. And here's what really gets me about this story. After the war, when those Polish soldiers were lost, when they couldn't go home, when they were refugees in a foreign country trying to figure out how to live in a world that had moved on without them, they still took care of Wojtek. They made sure he went somewhere safe. They visited him for years. They never forgot him. That's loyalty. That's love. That's what separates us from the monsters they'd been fighting. Wojtek's story reminds us that even in the worst of times, there's room for compassion. Even when the world is falling apart, small acts of kindness matter. Those soldiers didn't have to save that bear cub in Persia. They had every reason not to. But they did. And that decision rippled forward through time. It gave them something to care about during the war. It gave them comfort when they needed it most. And decades later, it gave the world a story worth remembering. A story about a bear who became a soldier, who fought in a war, who was loved by the men who served beside him. Today, when Polish veterans gather, they still tell stories about Wojtek, not about the battles they fought or the medals they earned. They tell stories about the time Wojtek stole someone's hat, about the time he got into the officer's tent and drank all their beer, about the time he sat with them through a bombing raid like it was just another day. These are the stories that matter. These are the moments that make us human. Wojtek died almost 60 years ago. Every single soldier who served with him is gone now. They've all passed away. But the bear they saved lives on, in statues and stories, in military insignias and history books, in the memories of Polish people who never even met him but feel connected to him anyway. Because Wojtek represents something eternal, the idea that in our darkest moments we can still choose to be kind, that we can still find joy, that we can still love something outside ourselves, that even in war, humanity survives. That's why grown men cried when this bear died, not because he was a bear, but because he was family, because he represented the best parts of who they were, because he'd been with them through everything, and saying goodbye meant accepting that that chapter of their lives was finally, truly over. So yeah, you might know about D-Day and Pearl Harbor and all the famous battles of World War II, but now you know about Wojtek too, the Syrian brown bear who became a corporal in the Polish army, who carried ammunition at Monte Cassino, who wrestled with soldiers and drank beer and smoked cigarettes. The bear who reminded everyone that even in the middle of hell, there's still room for love. Subscribe if you want more stories like this.